The sound of my uncle's laughter echoed off the ornate ceiling of the restaurant. A loud, obnoxious thing that always demanded to be the center of attention. He was soaking in the warmth of his own toast, a toast he had just made entirely at my expense. Then, through the fading chuckles, another voice cut in. It wasn't loud, but it was so clear and calm that it seemed to absorb all other sound in the room. Actually, Barry, her future is the reason your company was able to secure that overseas contract last year. My uncle's smirk didn't just fade. It shattered. His eyes snapped to the quiet man sitting beside him, a stranger he'd been trying to impress all night. The man's gaze was flat, professional. The intelligence brief she authored, the voice continued, prevented your entire initial investment from being nationalized. My government is in her debt. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and deeply satisfying. Uncle Barry just sat there, frozen. 2 hours earlier I had walked into that same restaurant with a familiar sense of dread. The event was a rehearsal dinner for my cousin, but it was really just another stage for my Uncle Barry, a loud, self-important real estate developer who measured everyone's worth by the size of their house and the status of their spouse. He caught me by the door, throwing a heavy arm over my shoulder. After a grand introduction of his son's fiancée, he turned the spotlight on me. And here's my globe-trotting niece, Anna, still flying solo. He boomed. Don't worry, we'll find you a husband one of these days. I gave him the same tight, practiced smile I'd been using for 10 years. It was the same line, just a different party. The familiar sting was there, that quiet reminder that in his eyes, my life of service, my entire career, it was all just a placeholder until a man showed up. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but on the outside, I was perfectly still, perfectly polite. This was my life's great balancing act. The real performance came during the toasts. Barry stood, glass held high, a self-satisfied grin plastered on his face as he winked directly at me. To family, and to building a future, he announced to the table, because let's be honest. He paused for dramatic effect. No ring, no future. A few people laughed, that uncomfortable sound of guests trying to be polite. The words just hung there in the warm air, a public verdict on my existence, delivered with a smug little bow. He had no idea what a future really cost. To them, my life was a vague, gray landscape of paperwork and lonely hotel rooms. A life of missed holidays and flimsy excuses. They filled in the blanks with their own pitying narrative, because the truth was something they couldn't even begin to comprehend. The disconnect was never clearer than at our family Christmas gathering last year. The house was loud, thick with the smell of pine and roasting turkey. And my Uncle Barry was holding court in the living room, as always. His son, my cousin Mark, had just closed some big real estate deal, and Barry was practically popping the buttons on his shirt with pride. He was a walking, talking billboard for his son's success, the money, the commission, the fancy new German car. Everyone was cooing and offering congratulations. Later, trying to make conversation, I mentioned that I had just gotten back from a work trip to Geneva. Barry just chuckled, not even looking up from his phone. Oh, another government boondoggle, eh? Bet the paperwork was thrilling. A few people smiled politely. I saw the look on my parents' faces, not defense, but a kind of weary apology. They just wanted a peaceful Christmas. It was the same tired dismissal I'd received for years. The time I returned from a 3-week trip, gaunt and exhausted, he'd asked if I'd gotten a nice tan. When I had to cancel on a family wedding with less than a day's notice, he loudly joked that my boring desk job must have a very strict vacation policy. They even had a nickname for me, one they thought was affectionate. They called me the diplomat, not because they imagined me negotiating treaties, but because they pictured me stamping passports in some dreary forgotten consulate, sorting out visa issues for tourists, a glorified clerk. Later that night, my mother, Carol, a woman who believed family harmony was worth any price, took me aside. You know how your uncle is, honey, she whispered. He just wants to see you settled and happy. Settled. To them, my life was a problem to be solved, and happiness was a synonym for marriage. What they pictured when I said work, and what my reality was, were two entirely different universes. Their world was warm, loud, and built on predictable metrics of success. Mine was cold, silent, and measured in outcomes that could never be spoken of. Just weeks before that Christmas, my boring trip to Geneva had actually been a series of tense back-channel meetings in a secure sterile room, a skiff, a sensitive compartmented information facility. There's no warmth in a room like that. The air is cold, filtered, and the silence is so complete you can hear your own heartbeat. I was on a secure video conference, the sole civilian analyst on a call with a panel of stone-faced officials. 3 of them were military brass, their chests heavy with ribbons, their expressions grim. My voice was the only one in the room as I delivered my assessment, the words clinical and precise. The back channel is live, but the asset is compromised. We need to shift to Protocol Gamma. I pointed to a sector on the encrypted satellite map glowing on the main screen. I'm advising the ambassador to deny all official knowledge until we can exfiltrate the package. The threat matrix is unacceptable. There was no argument, no second guessing. After a moment of dense silence, a decorated Air Force general, a man with 3 stars on his collar, simply nodded. His voice was gravelly, absolute. Do it. He looked directly at the camera, at me. Your call, Echo. Echo. In that world, I had a different name. A name that carried weight. A name that meant my judgment could shift policy and move assets across continents. A name that was trusted when lives were on the line. In that silent, freezing room, I had more authority and respect than my Uncle Barry could ever comprehend. And yet, I knew that if I'd tried to explain it, all he would have heard was the word paperwork. The duality was exhausting, a constant silent weight on my shoulders. My only real lifeline in the family was my cousin Sarah, the bride-to-be. She called me the week before the wedding, her voice laced with anxiety. I'm so glad you're coming, she'd said, but I just have to apologize in advance for my dad. I could picture her, pacing in her apartment, twisting the phone cord. Just ignore him, Anna, please, he doesn't get it. I think what you do is amazing, even if I don't really know what it is. Her support was a small, warm light in the suffocating fog of their misunderstanding. She didn't need to know the details, she just needed to know me, and for her, that was enough. She was the one exception in a family that had already written my story for me. As the last of the uncomfortable laughter died out, a familiar coldness settled deep in my bones. It was the practiced calm of a professional, the part of my brain that takes over in a crisis. My training kicked in, overriding the sting of humiliation. An emotional outburst in an unsecured environment is a tactical failure. My uncle hadn't just insulted me, he had created a public incident, and my job was now to manage the fallout without becoming a casualty myself. I had been in far more dangerous rooms than this one, and the objective was always the same. Observe. De-escalate. Extract. My strategy was simple and immediate. I would maintain perfect composure, a mask of polite indifference. I would let the comments slide, deflecting any follow-up questions with a vague smile. Then, at the earliest socially acceptable moment, probably after the cake was cut, I would make a graceful exit. I began a mental countdown, analyzing the situation not as a wounded niece, but as an operative determining an exit window. This was just another mission, I told myself. A deeply unpleasant one, but a mission nonetheless. My gaze drifted to the man sitting next to my uncle, the only person at the table I hadn't already accounted for. He was the unforeseen variable. I had clocked him when he arrived, of course, a habit I could never turn off. My mind had automatically run a low-level profile. His name was David Kalin, some business associate of the groom's father. The suit was well-tailored but conservative, designed to blend in, not stand out. His watch was a practical, durable model, not the flashy gold monstrosity my uncle wore. He was an observer, listening far more than he spoke. My assessment had been swift and certain, a mid-level executive, probably in finance or law. He was a low-level threat. Irrelevant to my personal situation, a background character. Across the table, I caught the eye of my cousin Sarah. Her face was a storm of fury on my behalf. I could see her gearing up to defend me, to rush into the line of fire and make things 1,000 times worse. I gave her the smallest, almost imperceptible shake of my head, my expression placid. It was a clear, non-verbal command. Stand down. I have this under control. It was a familiar burden, swallowing my own anger to manage the emotions of everyone around me. A lifetime of practice had made me an expert. My plan to simply fade into the background was working perfectly. My Uncle Barry, having successfully landed his verbal punch, was now basking in the afterglow. He was a man who fed on the attention of others, and after his toast he was feeling generous. He turned to the quiet man beside him, David Kalin, and clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture of assumed camaraderie. See? Barry said with a booming laugh, gesturing vaguely in my direction. Gotta keep these kids on the straight and narrow, right, David? He was looking for an ally, for another powerful man to validate his worldview. I braced myself for a polite nod, a non-committal grunt of agreement. I was ready to endure it. But it never came. Instead, David Kalin carefully, deliberately, placed his fork down on his plate. The small, sharp click of silver on porcelain cut through the lingering chatter. It was a tiny sound, but in that moment, it felt as loud as a gunshot. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. A lack of a ring is hardly an indicator of one's future, Barry. The words were calm, level, and held an unnerving weight. My uncle's smile faltered, confusion clouding his features. He opened his mouth to retort, to dismiss this as a joke, but Kalin continued, his gaze unwavering. In fact, he said, pausing just long enough for every eye at the table to fix on him, I'd say her future is significantly more secure than most. A strange, tense silence began to creep over our corner of the restaurant. My uncle's confusion was hardening into irritation. What's that supposed to mean? He blustered. Kalin ignored the tone, his expression unreadable. Your firm's expansion into the Gulf last year. He began, and I watched my uncle's posture change. This was his territory. Business. That entire venture, Kalin said slowly, was greenlit based on a risk assessment and geopolitical stability brief she authored. He gestured toward me with a slight nod. I felt my own blood run cold. This could not be happening. My uncle just stared, his face a mask of disbelief. That's ridiculous, he sputtered. She works some boring government job, paper pushing. He was flailing, trying to rebuild the narrative that had just been publicly dismantled. He turned his anger on Kalin. What are you talking about? Who the hell are you to know anything about my business? It was the fatal mistake. The one question that opened the door to everything else. David Kalin looked at my uncle for a long moment, then turned his head just slightly to give me a nod of profound, undeniable respect. It was a gesture from my other world, bleeding into this one. My name is David Kalin, he said, his voice still quiet, yet every person at the table leaned in to hear it. I'm the cultural attaché for the British Embassy. My uncle's jaw went slack. The title, embassy, hung in the air. A word that carried the weight of power and influence he understood. Your niece and I, Kalin continued, his gaze returning to my uncle's now pale face, were colleagues in Islamabad. He let that sink in, letting my uncle's brain frantically try to connect the dots between his perpetually single niece and a British diplomat in a city known for anything but boring paperwork. Then came the final, devastating blow. Her call sign during the embassy lockdown 2 years ago was Echo. The name felt alien in this warm, loud restaurant. It belonged to the world of concrete bunkers and encrypted radios. She was the operative the news credited with negotiating the safe passage of 30 personnel after the breach. Kalin's voice was like a surgeon's scalpel, clean and precise. He looked my uncle dead in the eye. Her future, as you call it, is ensuring people like you have a future to invest in. The silence that followed was no longer tense. It was absolute. It was a vacuum. I watched my uncle's face, a fascinating, slow-motion collapse of an entire worldview. He was a man who read the international news, a man who followed global markets. I could see the gears turning behind his eyes as he dredged up the memory of those frantic headlines. Islamabad embassy lockdown, hostages freed after tense negotiations, mystery operative praised. He was connecting the heroic anonymous figure from the news with the quiet, disappointing niece he'd been shaming just moments before. The vague government job snapped into terrifyingly sharp focus. Then, One by one, every member of my family turned to look at me. My mother, my father, my cousins, my aunts. The pity was gone. The condescension was gone. In its place was something I had never seen from them before, a mixture of shock, awe, and a healthy dose of fear. They weren't looking at Anna anymore. They were looking at Echo. They were looking at a complete stranger who had been sitting at their table her entire life. The most powerful thing David Kalin did all night was pick up his fork and take a bite of his salmon. After dropping a bomb that had shattered the foundations of my family's reality, he simply returned to his meal as if he had merely commented on the weather. The move was so nonchalant, so utterly devoid of drama, that it was absolute. There was nothing to argue with. The truth had been stated, and the conversation, the one that had defined my entire adult life within the family, was over. My Uncle Barry didn't say another word for the rest of the evening. He just sat there, a hollowed-out version of the man who had toasted my failure an hour earlier. He seemed smaller in his expensive suit, the boisterous energy that filled every room completely gone, leaving a quiet, bewildered old man in its place. The rest of the dinner passed in a surreal haze. For the first time, my relatives approached me not with pity, but with a hesitant, almost fearful respect. My aunt, who usually only asked about my dating life, wanted to know if I'd ever been to Paris. The question was so mundane, so comically off the mark that I almost laughed. They asked vague, clumsy questions, trying to peek behind the curtain without getting too close. I gave them polite, non-committal answers, my training in deflection, serving me better at a family dinner than it ever had in the field. I was no longer their pity project. I had become an enigma, a stranger they had known forever. When I left that night, no one told me to be safe. Their eyes told me they knew safety was my business. The silence from my uncle lasted for weeks, then months, but my own world, my real world, was moving forward. 6 months later, I was standing in a grand, flag-lined hall at the State Department in Washington, D.C. The air was filled with the quiet murmur of accomplished, serious people. I was there to receive a meritorious honor award for my work, and I was surrounded by my true peers. These were intelligence officers, seasoned diplomats, and military attachés, people who spoke my language, who understood the weight of the unspoken. There was no need for explanations here. My existence wasn't a question that needed answering. I saw a familiar face by the reception table and smiled. It was David Kalin. He shook my hand warmly, his eyes twinkling with a shared secret. "Congratulations, Echo," he said, using my call sign with a wry smile. "Well deserved." We chatted for a moment, and then he leaned in slightly. "You know, I heard from your uncle," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He sent a panicked email to the embassy the next day. He wanted to verify my credentials." I stared at him, and then I started to laugh. A real, genuine laugh. "He thought I was making it all up," Kalin finished, chuckling with me. "I think you scared him." In that moment, sharing that absurd punchline with a true colleague, I felt a sense of victory more profound than any public apology could have offered. A few weeks after the ceremony, an email from my mother appeared in my inbox. I was in my office, a quiet space where my thoughts were my own, and the sight of her name no longer triggered a knot of anxiety in my stomach. The email was rambling, full of family news, but the real purpose was buried in the third paragraph. "Your Uncle Barry called," she wrote. "He was humbled. He wanted to know if you might be able to look over some security documents for a new international venture he's considering." It was a clumsy, self-serving olive branch, an attempt to finally leverage the power he had once mocked. It was the only way he knew how to apologize, by asking for something. 10 years ago, that email would have sent me into a spiral of anger and obligation. 5 years ago, I might have done it just to feel, for once, that my skills were valued by them. But now, I felt nothing but a calm, quiet clarity. The ledger was balanced. The debt was paid. I typed out a brief, professional reply. "My professional consultations are handled through official State Department channels," I wrote. "I've attached the appropriate contact information for the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs." I hit send without a moment's hesitation, then moved the entire conversation to my archive folder. My peace was no longer tied to his approval. It was defined by my protocols. My uncle thought my value was measured by who might choose me. I had built a life where nations chose me instead. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who should have seen you most clearly, share your story in the comments. In this community, your expertise is always recognized.